Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today is a book club episode brought to us by Hidase Publishers, and you're going to learn more about that publishing company from our guest today. And the author of today's book, we have Cyril Chavis Jr., and he wrote the book, The Bible Explained, a college student's guide to understanding their faith. And go ahead and go to our show notes and click the Hidase link. It'll take you right to this book and learn more about Reverend Chavis. And then also, if you guys go to our show notes, there's going to be other resource information about how to find us. We are on YouTube. Subscribe to us there. Check us out. Watch these conversations via video. And then also you can check us out on audio only podcast apps. As usual, we're a podcast, so that makes sense. And then our email address, and you can find us on Twitter and Instagram for daily content and what's going on. You can go also, if you're having a hard time finding a church near you and you want to find a Reformed church, click that church finder link and type in your zip code, and you can find one there. And then I want to go in and read the endorsement of a guest we've had on our show before. So we've had Erwin Ince, Dr. Erwin Ince, on our show a few times, and we love the guy. So that's the one endorsement we've had on the show before. So I'm going to read his endorsement about Cyril's book here. Dr. Erwin Ince says this about the book. 35 years ago, during my undergraduate years, I jettisoned the Christian faith of my childhood for the Afrocentric movement. I viewed Christianity as the white man's religion. God in his kindness eventually rejected my rejection of him. However, if I had a resource like Reverend Cyril Chavis's The Bible Explained book, I would have been able to engage my false understanding of the Christian faith. Cyril has magnificently brought to bear the beauty of Reformed theology with the testimony of the African American Christian experience to disciple college students of African descent. I believe many will come to faith in Christ and be strengthened in their faith by reading this book. So we think so too. And so we got a great conversation here ahead of us. I'm going to let Peter further introduce our guest today, Cyril Chavis.
Yeah, we got Cyril Chavis, who's currently the RUF director at Howard University. This is in Washington, D.C. I'm going over to his author page right now. And he's also the founder and CEO, as Nick kind of alluded to, of Hidase Publishing, a Black-owned publisher creating Christian content for the African diaspora and content. We're going to kind of talk about that and how that relates to this book as well. He's an ordained minister who currently serves students through RUF. He's served the RUF chapter at Jackson State, which I think is getting more press now with Coach Prime at University of Colorado, former coach at Jackson State. And since then, he has been serving the RUF chapter at Howard. He graduated from University of Virginia with a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies and graduated from RTS Jackson campus. We know well. We've had a ton of their professors on our show with an MDiv with a biblical exegesis emphasis, happily married to Jenell, and they live in Washington, D.C. with their three children. So it's a pleasure having you on, Reverend Chavis.
Man, it is a joy to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. And so we got it. This is our soft on-ramp onto this show. And we just talked about this. I asked the question before recording when your birthday was. And we learned that you had the same exact birthday, year, month, day as Nick's wife. What's it feel like sharing such an esteemed honor with Nick's wife?
Man,
same area code or same time zone too.
That'd be weird.
Man.
Same area code.
Same
Yeah.
time zone, Eastern time zone. We won't put you on blast and publicize to the world you're in my wife's birthday, but
No, I won't say exactly what it is, but yeah.
I feel, I feel honored. I feel deeply honored.
That's right.
That the things have aligned in that way. But no, it is cool to find birthday twins.
Mm-hmm.
So
we share the same birth year, but you and his wife share everything. The entire. Now, what time were you born? That's the big
Right.
question. Now we got to figure out what time Nick's wife was born, and then we can like really sing things up.
And I don't know what time I was born, but there's an interesting fact about me. I'm a twin.
Oh, okay.
So I know I was born 30 minutes after my twin sister.
Does she let you know that all the time? Like she's the older sister?
No, not really. She's like, pretty humble about it. But like, but my mom does let me know often. Like, man, like I don't know what you were doing. You're taking your time.
That's true. 30
minutes
for a twin is kind of long. It's usually like a minute or so, or like like 30 seconds, but 30 minutes.
Yep, and it's crazy because I never, growing up, they would say 30 minutes, and that like time frame meant nothing to me in the labor room until I had my own kids, and I was like, 30 minutes. I was like, man, hats off to my mom. Women are amazing for what they do in giving birth.
Yep.
It could be like Jacob and Esau, where he's pretty much the same time. He's just grabbing onto his foot, his heel as he's coming out.
Right. And
Cyril was like, no, you get out of here. I'm staying here for a little bit longer.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm going to stretch out. It's been cramped in here.
Now I got room. To stretch out the limbs.
Yeah.
Cool. So kind of on more to stuff about this book. So tell our audience maybe just more about yourself and maybe too about Hidase too. What's kind of special about this publishing company that you started with your wife, and then kind of the background for yourself in this book as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Cyril Chavis. I am from Virginia Beach, Virginia. I grew up in an amazing home with 2 Christian parents. I was baptized around 10 or 11 years old. And yeah, my dad was in the Navy, so we moved around a little bit. I spent some time in Sicily and Texas. I was actually born in Silver Spring, Maryland, but spent most of my life in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and went to UVA for undergrad. And when I got there, I was just a knucklehead and was a professing Christian, would go to church every Sunday, but I just wasn't serious about my faith. And so either I was regenerated my first year in college, or I just, had a good wake-up call from the Lord from just partying and engaging in all the idols that I had. And I basically just got in trouble with drinking. And that was just kind of just like a little punch in the gut from the Lord. He was just saying, Cyril, what are you doing? And I think that's when I realized that idols always overpromise and underdeliver. I'm just like, Cyril, like, what are you investing your time in? What promises are you looking for from the things you're investing your time in? And so got pretty involved with campus ministry there and quickly discerned a call to ministry. So I was a part of a local church up there, and I'd actually been licensed to preach when I was around my junior year in college from my home church. And so I grew up in a traditional Black Baptist church. Great experience.
You started preaching young in those churches.
Yep. So I was writing sermons, in my room in my off-campus housing, and would go back home during the breaks and like meet up with my pastor, and he would read the sermons and stuff. And so was licensed to preach and had a desire to pursue ministry. And so the church I was a part of in Charlottesville, they were big fans of just the Reformed kind of world and Reformed circle. And I just never heard of Reformed theology. It's like, what is this? Why are they so excited about it? This is weird. It seems a little bit, is this a cult? Like, what is it? And so I kind of like dug in and was like, okay, yeah, I think I believe like at least 95% of all this stuff. And so I went to RTS Jackson. So I was there for 4 years. And when I started RTS Jackson, I became an intern for the RUF at Jackson State.
Yep.
And then halfway through seminary, the campus minister there went on to pastor a local church, Redeemer Church in Jackson. And I became the lead guy there with a team there. So I was doing that part-time and then doing seminary. Then I became full-time and ordained when I graduated seminary. Did RUF at Jackson State for a little longer. then moved up here to start an RUF chapter at Howard University. I got married halfway through seminary to my wonderful wife, Jenell. And I have 3 kids, Aria, Elise, and Kyrie. So they're 5, 4, and 2.
Awesome.
So yeah, campus ministry is my thing. I'm a PCA pastor, and I just love college students, and I love doing ministry on HBCUs. That stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. And yeah, I've been having fun doing that.
Heck yeah. Tell us too a little bit more about Hidase. That's
yeah.
I think it's gonna speak to some of our audience. I mean, hopefully all of our audience, maybe a particular subset of our audience who's interested in some of the work that you do, particularly so with kind of Christian sources and historically Black sources. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about the publishing business that you guys started.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I'm finding out as I grow in ministry, I'm a builder, like I'm a starter.
Okay.
And whenever I have like a godly discontent and I'm looking around and I'm like, come on, guys, let's do this. Let's do this. And, I'm just like, all right, let's do it. Why not?
Yeah.
And so I developed a burden that really, so a couple things, that Christianity is the strongest and lasts the longest in context where the theology is intentionally contextualized to that people group. Essentially, they're giving God's answers to the people's questions in ways that they can understand.
Each particular people group's questions are answered by God in their particular ways, but also generally speaking too.
Yep, as well. Yeah, absolutely. Like the timeless truths of God's word being applied to timely questions.
Absolutely. Yep.
And so that's the first conviction. The second conviction is that I really believe that this happens best with that people's own leaders as you look at church history. And so I'm looking at kind of in particular the Reformed Presbyterian realm of things.
Sure.
And I'm saying there's really not a ton of African-American Reformed authors.
Not a great history between Presbyterians and Black ministers if you look back at our history.
Right. And so I'm thinking, okay, how can we, we're kind of in this tradition. How can we own it for ourselves? How can we, people in the past in our tradition have talked about an indigenous Reformed African-American movement. I kind of call it a Black Presbyterian movement. Like, what does this actually look like? And I think a big part of it is producing content from and for this particular demographic. In my case, I'm most familiar with African Americans, particularly like the Gen Z kind of demographic. And so, man, I really want Hidase Publishing to, because there's tons of people with tons of content. Like, I know all these ministry leaders and pastors and theologians, and I'm like, all right, how can I just be the young, hungry, energetic guy who encourages other people who have like all these things to offer to put it out there? And so Vince Bantu has been inspiring as I read his kind of church history book, A Multitude of All Peoples, I believe it's called.
Yep.
And he kind of highlights this throughout church history of like how the Christian faith takes root in certain places the most powerfully. And then also looking at in the African American community, we've always kind of, publishing has always been a big part of what we do because traditionally, given the history of racism and just colonialism, oftentimes Black writers and kind of content producers haven't had the means to take ownership over their own kind of words and thoughts. It always has to kind of go through this bigger thing that has the resources to get it out there.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking through, like, what does it look like to contribute to the shalom of the African American community by like through kind of economic empowerment? Let's like own our own stuff. Let's distribute our own stuff, and kind of as a way of doing mercy ministry to our own demographic. So awesome. All of that is kind of like behind why I'm trying to, like, in my spare time, push that forward.
Sure. Yeah. And that kind of fuels this book too. Some of the background behind this book before we get into the next, like, kind of like real kind of meaty question. How does your work with Hidase, founding this, historically Black college universities and colleges, how does that inform this particular book that you wrote for, I mean, really your students at Howard and for any other students around who might be looking at something like this, or ministers looking for something like this too?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how does this book inform what I do on the college campus?
Oh yeah, how does what you've done kind of inform this book, and then the other way around? So how
Okay,
have they
got
kind
you,
of
got you,
mutually
got you.
informed each other? Yeah.
Yeah. So on the college campus, as I'm discipling college students, as I'm meeting up with them, it's so easy to kind of just do things based off of whim or what we just feel in the moment. And maybe that's an exaggeration, but so essentially, like if I'm thinking about what I'm going to teach next semester,
Yeah.
I'm like, it'd be really cool to teach this, or it would be like really great. We haven't done this before, but I actually wanted to start thinking really intentionally about what am I teaching my students? What are they learning? How am I
Yeah.
shaping them? And that kind of flowed out of some experiences I had. So one experience is I remember I was sitting across from a student and I was just talking with her about the Lord, and we were talking about the gospel, and she was talking about her sin. And she said something like, I mean, because, Jesus wasn't perfect. Like he had sin
Oh.
too. And I'm just like, you've
Hold
been
up.
a part of this ministry way too long to say that. Like,
Yeah.
what's happening here? Like,
Yeah.
I was like, I felt convicted as a
Yeah.
pastor.
How
I'm
did
like,
I mess up
like,
to get to this answer?
right. I'm just like, this wasn't broadcasted well enough in this group. And so it
Yeah.
just had me thinking, like, okay, how do we shape our students theologically to where we kind of give them a set, almost like there's a consistent product
Yeah.
when they graduate as far as what they've learned, what they've been exposed to.
Yep.
And I remember like that was at Jackson State, and also at Jackson State, students would invite me to different churches in town. And so there'd be like a prophet who would come to do a prophetic experience. And as I'm listening to the ways that they're teaching and preaching, I'm just like, this is so far off from what we do with RUF. Like, why don't the students know the difference
Oh,
between
yeah.
what's happening here and what's
Yeah,
happening
yeah.
in RUF? And I'm thinking, I'm not giving them theological categories. Like I'm not
They can't
giving
discern what's happening here. It's like, oh, this is different than what Cyril's been teaching me. What, like, why am I here?
right. And so and so I'm thinking, okay, I gotta be more intentional. And then so as I'm discipling students at Howard, I'm like, okay, I would love to have a systematic way to deliver the Christian faith to them in a way that speaks directly to them. And as I was looking just around, I didn't really see that book. I mean, it might be out there, but I couldn't find it. One that's from a Reformed perspective, that's speaking to HBCU students, that kind of has those things in mind. So, like I said, like I'm the type of guy where it's like, well, I'm looking around.
Doesn't
like,
exist.
All right,
I'm gonna create it. Yeah.
yeah, why don't I do it?
Yeah. I
So
like
I
it.
really kind of see this book as like a part of a 4-year curriculum. And they should basically walk away with the basics of the gospel story, like the source of the gospel, which is the scriptures, the God of the gospel, the need for the gospel itself, and the blessings of the gospel. And that's kind of the flow of the book. And I really want them to walk away being filled with the joy that comes with understanding your faith, like confidently walking with God, being like, I understand him and what he's about and what the scriptures are about in the basics. So
yeah, which is
kind of a
so
little bit of the
opposite how
burden.
most college students come out of college, because most just aren't prepared before college, and then college kind of smacks them across the face. And then they come out knowing nothing, and then it's like, what am I going to go to church for? This has been useless. This doesn't inform my life at all. And so you want to reverse this trend.
Yep, absolutely. And another part of the burden was as I was sitting at the commencement ceremonies, watching these students walk across the stage. I feel like every campus minister, campus leader is feeling that weight. Like, what did they learn in the past? However many years I had them, did I set them up with teaching, with demonstrating the gospel, of being in their lives? Did I set them up to walk with Jesus for a lifetime? Like, like Ephesians 4, like have they grown in the knowledge of Jesus so that they're not tossed to and fro by every wind and wave of doctrine? And so that kind of burden is a part of creating this resource where at the very least, even if you came to RUF for a semester, at least you have the book in your hand, at least is there, the content is there. And, like I've done with so many books, it'll be years after I've received the resource and I pick it up and I'm like, oh, like, man, this is so good. I wish I read this 3 years ago when that person gifted it to me,
Yeah, totally. Cool.
Speaking of having a book in your hand, I got your book in my hand here, going into the zeroing in more specifically on this book that we're talking about, The Bible Explained: A College Student's Guide to Understanding Their Faith. So I'll make my first question. You rhetorically actually ask in the book and then answer in a section prior to chapter 1. So the kind of the preface part, you ask, why should I read this book? And knowing the main goal of this book is for the reader to understand, what's that more specifically mean as you further answer the question in the beginning of your book?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. So Barna Group, just reading some of their Gen Z studies, they say that this generation is the first post-Christian generation, and they're the least biblically literate generation. And so when I think about understanding, I'm thinking of this generation coming up. They're not familiar with the Bible. Like the generation where you can just walk up to someone and say, "What's your favorite Bible verse?" or "What's your favorite Bible book?" Like this generation doesn't know. Like they're like, "I don't really know Bible books. I don't really know Bible verses." But they're hungry. Like they are spiritually hungry, and they are curious. And so I want to meet them in their need for in a Christianity that makes sense intellectually, that's coherent, and you can put it together. In other words, like I think what we call systematic theology is going to be key for this generation, connecting the dots of a lot of things they've heard. And so I'm thinking about a student as they get involved with our ministry, they get involved with our community, they make friends, they might experience some type of influence of the Spirit from being around, whether they're converted or not. They're like, "Oh man, like this group feels great. This Jesus thing feels great." They become converted and they're growing, but at some point in that process, they're asking, "Okay, what does all this mean?" And so I want this resource to be a way that they can understand the faith. So it's really kind of for college students who are seeking. They've heard a ton of things about Christianity and they're really not sure what it is and they want to investigate it. Or students who have been a Christian for a while and they're just hungry. They're like, "I've grown up with this." Maybe they're a Reformed Christian and they're like, "You know what? I've always believed in Reformed theology, but I actually don't know all the ins and outs of it. What is theology and kind of how does the Bible fit together?" And really part of this was, man, I have like fond memories of buying my real first theology books. Like I remember when I was a college student and I got challenged and people were like, "Man, you need to dig deeper into the scriptures." And I'm like, "Man, what book should I buy?" And I remember they recommended Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology to me.
Yeah. That was big time back in the day.
Yep. And they also recommended F.F. Bruce's Canon of Scripture.
Yep.
And so I just remembered, one summer, maybe the summer of my junior year, just like reading that, like literally, like I would wake up, go to the gym, come home, eat, and just like read that systematic theology, read that like dense book on inerrancy and the scriptures and just read the Bible. And I remember just a couple other books being those like big moments for me. And so I was like, man, what would it be like to create that big moment for college students? They're like first theology book and it really speaks to them and they can have it and they can go to it as a resource. So that's kind of the heart behind it.
Like, yeah, that's awesome. And so I like that you actually have not stated kind of the backbone of this book. Of course, it's for your students. It's for those college students who are looking to dive deeper into the faith. But you follow explicitly the Westminster Shorter Catechism. So the first, I think, 38 questions, if I have that right, of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, you follow it to help guide your students in the Christian faith and apply in a way that makes sense to them. And I think a lot of people are like, "Well, the Westminster Standard, like that's some pretty high level stuff right there. I don't know if college students can keep up with this stuff or it makes sense for them." But you break it down in a way, and of course, the Westminster Shorter was originally meant for kids, so it's kind of it's even meant for those who are younger than us. But like you said, we're so illiterate that sometimes it's kind of above us. So how do you go from various question answers in the Westminster Shorter? Because you don't say, "Okay, question answer this, now let's explain it," but you kind of flow through the questions and answers without saying, "Hey, here's question this, here's answer this." So how do you flow through these question answers to the lives of your students?
Man, that's a good question. Um,
'Cause I think a lot of people are who are wondering, how do I teach the Reformed faith? They use the shorter or the larger catechism of confession of faith and say, like without just doing, here's the question, memorize the answer, in a way that makes sense for them, like we talk about in this book, culturally or age appropriate, or like something that makes sense for them where they're at,
yep,
versus
yep.
just kind of a straight question answer stuff.
Yeah, so I remember reading, so Dr. Carl Ellis, he's an RTS professor,
Yep.
and he has a book called Free at Last. And he has these really cool categories for theology. He talks about classical theology and
Mhm.
jazz theology. And so kind of the category. So I actually took classes at Howard when
Hmm.
I first moved up here,
Okay.
just to really get to know the university and get to
Totally.
know
Yeah.
students.
Culture, people, the teachers and stuff. Yeah.
Yep, just immerse myself. And so I always told myself, so when I was at Jackson State, I learned a ton. And I said, if I ever did this again, I would do a few things. And one of them is befriend musicians and artists early, so that when it was time to actually like do large group and
Hmm.
like and you really want like artists and musicians to be in the mix, like they're there. But also just I love music, musicians and artists, and I feel like our group didn't have like a ton of them, but when we did have them, they were just like super cool. So our group's really artsy right now.
Okay.
But but I remember signing up for piano instruction one,
Huh.
and I remember the teacher, she's a classical piano teacher, and she would have the music up, and I had to play every note correctly. It was about precision, it was about accuracy.
Yep.
And she would make me keep a journal and would like, it was like this really intense, like Excel spreadsheet type of journal. Like, what I can't even remember the technical terms at this point now. This was years, like 4 years ago, but like what system, what bar, what note, what
Yep.
beat did I miss? And so it was all about precision. And so that's kind of like in many ways what confessions, catechisms, creeds are. They're about precision, they're about accuracy, and they don't really change much across like time and culture.
No.
And so like Dr. Ellis, he says this in his book. The classical approach to theology comprises the formal methods of arranging what we know about God and his world into a reasoned, cogent, and consistent system. So, end quote. So it's kind of like theology as science. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what like the catechism is.
Hmm.
But jazz theology. So when I was at Howard, I
Hmm.
took classical piano my first semester there. And so as a non-degree seeking student, you can only take 2 semesters of courses.
Huh.
So my second semester, I took jazz keyboard harmony, and this
Heck
is
yeah. Yeah.
I know no music, so I'm up in there, and it's actually really cool. So like a jazz like living legend is teaching me. He
Hmm.
teaches at Howard. His Dr. Cyrus Chestnut. People are into jazz piano will probably recognize his name,
Sure.
but he just very graciously he's a Christian. He just very graciously takes me on as a student because I tell him like I want to kind of get into getting creative with music with hymns. He's like, yeah, sure, sign up. So we're in there, and he's really into like, he's technical, but he was more so leaning on like let what's inside of you flow out and like really let the thing that you have to offer move through your fingers, and it's
Yeah.
very much about like the moment expression. And so, but there's still there's the song is still the song, right? Like there's still a set of notes that make the song a song. So this is kind of like, so Dr. Ellis says jazz theology investigates God's dealing with the people and the joys and trials of daily life. And it is not so much concerned with facts as it is with life skills, knowing how rather than knowing that. So like end quote. And so it's basically talking about what we talk about, the indicative or the interpretation versus the application.
Hmm.
So we have like classical theology as these truths, and then like jazz theology is how we apply them to our people, like sermons and Bible studies and like even popular theology books. And so that's really the process I'm doing in this book. Like I'm taking these kind of abstract truths, these propositions, and I'm fleshing them out as I address students' fears, their concerns, their struggles, their sin issues. And so we should always be doing this with our catechisms, creeds, confessions. And I think we do intuitively. And the people who we really love to listen to, the people who we really love to listen teach the
Mhm.
people who teach those who we love to listen to,
I got what you're saying. Yep.
they do that well. Like they apply it. It's
Yeah.
like it's deep theologically, but it's also very devotional and rich. And so
Yeah. And it
I'm really
sticks with
trying to
you a
do
little
that.
bit better when it's applied in that way. It like the truth makes more sense to you versus just kind of floating above you.
Yep, yep. And so I tried as hard as, I mean, I still think, I mean, I like the book, but I still think it could be dense at moments. And
Mm.
so like I hope that like students as they read it, they'll, you know, be gracious with me in those moments where I'm like, all right, I'm
Totally.
trying to make this as like applicable as possible, but I just
Yeah.
gotta like press through the Trinity right here, or like I gotta talk about like one person, two natures,
Yeah.
and like I just
Yeah.
trying as hard as
I
I
do
can to make
think
this apply.
there's a somewhat of a natural flow in the book where you start off um not surface is the wrong way, but clear. And then it does get, you can call it denser towards the end. But my guess is your hope, and those who read this, the hope is like they've kind of built in these categories. By the time they get to the denser stuff, they can handle it a little bit better. Versus, yeah, if you don't have it, if you don't have any categories, then it's going to be hard. And we have to, Christians need meat. We need deep doctrine, but we need categories to kind of put those doctrinal topics into as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's the goal with the book.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
And kind of bridging that too is just like music, books need structure
Yeah.
to, telling and developing stories, make it understandable, make categories so that people can progressively understand what you're unpacking, instead of just random information just thrown everywhere. So music and books and just the way the human brain works is like that. So they're just like music you're describing. For it to make sense, there's a structure to a book, and your book structures into four main parts, and there's probably a reason for them. So we wanted to ask and maybe give us a 30,000-foot summary of each one, or what the main reason was or focus of each one. So the four are revelation, relationship, rescue story, and rescue's effect. So I'll just let you kind of go from there.
Yep. So I tried to follow, essentially I tried to make this a systematic theology book for college
Mhm.
students. So I tried to follow the typical flow of a systematic theology.
Yep.
We talk about scripture and then theology proper.
Mhm.
And then we talk about humanity.
Which is where the Westminster Confession goes. So you're just kind of following that.
Yep. So it worked out perfectly. Talking about humanity and image of God, then sin. Then we're talking about the gospel, person and work of Jesus. And then we're talking about the hope that we have. We're talking a little bit about eschatology.
Yep.
And so, but basically I tried to really make it down to earth, and, I'm a preacher, so got to make things alliterate. So
That's right. Yeah.
that's why, revelation, which is the scriptures, how God reveals himself to us and his desires for us. Relationship, which is God's relationship with us and how that was intended to be, then how it went wrong. Rescue story, which is basically Historia Salutis, like the history of salvation, and then rescue's effect, the Ordo Salutis, like kind of how this story, how this rescue actually gets into our lives.
Yeah.
So really, with Revelation, I talk about how we can't know anything unless God reveals it to us, and I talk about what the Bible is. Is it, why is it true? Why can we trust it? I talk about biblical interpretation. And all throughout these sections, I'm kind of addressing different questions that I think college students might have, and particularly African-American college students. And so I kind of address a lot of the questions that African-Americans have around the Bible and its relationship to the history of racism in the American church. And can the Bible be trusted with how it's been abused and how it's been used to uphold versions of racist theology? And so I kind of get into that. And so I not only challenge racist interpretations, but also challenge African-American interpretations that react to the racist interpretations in ways that discard or maybe distrust the Bible. And so I really want to drive home that the scriptures provide African-Americans the only source of true and lasting hope. And so then the next part, relationship, talk about who God is, his character, his attributes, and just talk about really try and drive home that we would say we know. I mean, I would say this when I was a college student. I would say I knew God until I read like A.W. Tozer's The Knowledge of the Holy. And I was
I know
like,
nothing about God.
and I was like, dang, like this is a great deep dive into every attribute. And even just reading J.I. Packer's Knowing God. And it's just like, man, like
that was my first theological read in college, was Knowing God. And I was like,
Yep.
oh, that was way above my head when I first
Yeah.
read it.
Yep. That's definitely, you got to read that one slowly and just chew on that one as a college student. And so from the doctrine of God, everything else flows. Like, so really that's part of the flow of just any systematic theology and a part of the flow of the book. And then really dive deep. And then next, I really dive deep into the image of God. Who are we as humans? What did God make us to be? What's our purpose within the cosmos? And I talk about sin and what went wrong, that we have rebelled against God. We have failed to live out our identity as creatures who bear God's image. And then Rescue's story talks about Jesus and what he's done, his person and work, that we needed someone to come save us. And he redeemed us. Like at the center of his work is redemption as a prophet, a priest, and a king. And I talk about like how people have, how we've, the kind of the questions we have as it relates to, for example, like the cross, and why did Jesus have to die in that way? Or why did Jesus have to be God? So just asking those questions. And then the last part is Rescue's effect, talking about blessings, like really what blessings does his redemption bring? And this is kind of where, this is my favorite part, because it just gets to like, you kind of just revel in all of that, all that Jesus brings to us, explaining things like justification, adoption, sanctification, like the assurance of God's love.
Question answers 30 to 38. That's some good stuff right there.
Yeah. So that's kind of the flow, and just trying to apply it to their lives, bringing like y'all shows about bridging the gap.
Heck yeah. So you've talked a lot about this, and we've talked a little bit about it, and so I want to address it, because I think a lot of our audience, when they hear a lot about HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, African American students, and this is written to African American students more particularly, so they might wonder, well, Cyril, I'm not Black, and I don't work with Black students, so why should I use this? How do I use this in my own context? And I'm sure we have Black listeners who are like, oh, absolutely, I can use this, and this is maybe not a 1-to-1 ratio, but it's closer. And you actually talk about this in your book, especially with contextualizing the gospel message and our confessional standards for particular people, which you do in your context. So how can people do what you do with historically Black colleges and universities to their own context? If it's Asian, if it's Hispanic, if it's Native American, whatever it may be, how can they do what you've done for historically Black Christians or whatever it may be for their own context?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's my conviction, that everyone already does what I'm doing in this book, whether they're aware of it or not. Like, we're always speaking from a certain context to a certain context. Yeah, we're speaking cultural language, even just literally language, like speaking English, like that makes sense to certain people, and it doesn't make sense to others. And speaking English, I guess in the United States, that's all we got for the most part.
But speaking at least English, dominantly, yeah, sure.
Right. Yeah. Dominantly. Yes. I'm kind of poking fun at us. But we need to do better than just having dominantly English. But like that's a choice of in theology. How do we speak these truths to this audience?
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to be very explicit about that. Like, as I'm writing this book, I'm aware that the things that I say, the questions I choose to answer, the things I choose to emphasize are based upon an audience that I am thinking about. And so this is actually what the scriptures do.
Yeah.
And this is kind of like one of the biggest jobs of pastors and theologians when they deal exegetically with a passage.
Big time.
They're helping you figure out what questions that Bible audience was asking. And this really shows up, and I love it, in the books of First and Second Corinthians. Like literally he's answering questions that they're
very
asking.
Pointed. Yep.
Yep. And he's getting very detailed. He's answering questions about eating meat sacrificed to idols. Like, I love that. Like, he is a pastor, he's like, I'm getting in the weeds. I'm getting in the nitty gritty of your life, and I'm answering your questions with the gospel, and I'm applying the gospel to your specific questions. And I think sometimes in Reformed circles, we'll give the like abstract doctrinal truths, and we'll leave it up to the parishioners and the Holy Spirit to apply it themselves. It's like, no, like, that's our work as ministry leaders and pastors, is to help them imagine what these truths look like in application in their lives. And so, we see this in every Bible book. We see this in Romans, like the things that he talks about deal with the issues and the situations that the Romans are going through.
Doesn't mean they're not universal in some aspect, but they're particularly applied in that context.
Absolutely. And here's the beautiful thing. Because they're particularly applied, we more vividly see the universal truths in action. True. And so it's like the reason why we know so much about the gospel and weakness and how it applies to us in our weakness is because we read 2 Corinthians in such a particular book.
Yeah.
Like, the reason why we know about Christian liberty of conscience is because we can read 1 Corinthians 8-10, and like, we can see those things vividly applied, and it just enriches everybody when we do that. So by applying these truths to a particular time, people, and situation, my hope is that they'll more vividly see the gospel, and it'll apply, like the application will benefit people, because they'll look at this. Maybe they've never thought about questions that Black students are asking, and they're like, oh, like, I never saw the gospel from that angle, or I've never seen anyone talk about that topic as it relates to Jesus and who he was. And now that gives them a whole nother avenue of prayer and exploration into the scriptures. And so everyone should be doing that. We should be reading each other's theologies. We should be looking at the gospel from each other's vantage points. We should be looking at what jumps out on the page to somebody else, because I might not have seen it. And this just enriches us all.
Heck yeah. And a slight question to add on top of this, because of your kind of entrepreneurial work with Hidase, looking like the African-American voices to speak into African-American lives, maybe talk a little bit too about, with the particular context that you preach to, what kind of theologians, what kind of voices are you pulling in this book to speak to them, and not saying you can't pull in a white voice and like, oh, I can't listen to a white voice, or white person can't listen to a Black voice. I'm not saying that at all. But particularly they hear people from their own culture, their own background, their own status, whatever it may be. So how did you use different theologians, different voices to speak to your students more particularly so?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. So part of my big goal, so initially, so like when I first started writing this book, it was actually I wrote the first. So I have a draft of every question in the Shorter Catechism.
Yep.
And the book just got really, really long. So I was like, let me just focus on the beliefs section of the Shorter Catechism. And so part of that, also what I wanted to do is write kind of along with the book, kind of different summaries of theologians of African descent from the past. And so I'm like, the book is already too long, and it's kind of 2 books in one. Sure. And so I said, all right, I'm going to shorten that and just like sprinkle it throughout this book. So like every chapter, there is some African-American theologian or Christian or leader who kind of embodies the teachings of that chapter. And so I really want to, so here's the thing, like when we talk about Christian history, we realize that no one is a Christian in a vacuum.
No.
Like we all inherit beliefs, practices, and stories from a previous generation.
Yeah.
And so this is me helping students be connected to the beliefs, practices, and stories of the previous generations of Christians that were, and I guess are, because they're just in the heavenlies, they are asking the same questions that they are asking. And so it's like, hey, let's lean on the wisdom of those in the past. Let's let old friends speak into new times.
Mm-hmm.
So I lean on people like unlikelies, like Phyllis Wheatley,
Mm-hmm.
and some people, some theologians that people might not have heard of, like Mariah Stewart, and
Mm-hmm.
I lean on, like Augustine,
Yeah,
and
I was about to say Augustine makes his entrance there a lot because the dude's African, so he's a black theologian, so he's gonna
yep,
find his way in this book.
yep. I lean on Athanasius, and
Yep.
I lean on Augustine's mom,
Yep.
Monica, who's really
Yep.
the hero of
Totally. Yeah, because his
Augustine's
father is
Confessions.
Roman and his mother's
Yep.
Egyptian or African. I forget what
Yeah.
she was exactly.
Yeah, she's of North African descent,
Yeah.
Berber. But,
Yep.
but yeah, she, and yeah, I just love his story. And so I'm trying to introduce my students to these different theologians, Christians.
Like you come in this long line of African American thinkers, theologians, pastors, whatever it may be. This is your history that you can kind of live into.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah, I got a couple reflection statements before my last question, because I know after this next question, my last question, I won't have a chance to say what kind of I've learned from your book and learned from this conversation and been
This is called
reminded
Nick's
about.
brain dump right here.
Yes,
Yeah. I write
love
things. I write things down as the conversation goes. So first one, like you're saying, the writer, whatever human writer is writing about in the Bible, there's a context of that author or the audience at that time. There's context there. And Paul's letters in the first century to those churches, and you mentioned 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it would almost seem like he's talking to the American churches in some of in his letters, these epistles. I mean, a lot of the stuff that he talks about is timeless. It's contextually brilliant by the help of the Holy Spirit to the people hearing it then and now. And that's why it's like you can still preach on Romans and Ephesians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and they're just as applicable today as they were then.
Yep.
So that's brilliant. And the next part is you and Peter already kind of alluded to this, but I wrote down that we're talking about a lot of people not knowing the Bible these days very well. And a lot of people, even a lot of Christians, might not realize a lot of the first churches were in Africa. Christianity really had its very beginnings in Africa. Like
Christianity is not a Western religion; it is a global religion, but started in the East.
Yeah, it's
right.
First origins, first churches were really in Africa, and like you'd say, some of the first big theologians were African. And we talk about, even Augustine and Athanasius, and there's people before them, obviously.
Tertullian probably wasn't all that white. Yeah, there's a lot of people in our history who, in a sense, have been whitewashed, but we just kind of assume everyone looks like us, thinks like us, talks like us, all that stuff.
Yep. Yeah. And it just changes the way you read the Bible, because even when you read the Bible, you're thinking, these people are in Africa. They're in Egypt for 430 years, and they're being freed. And you look at Moses with his Cushite wife, and in that episode in Numbers, and then you're looking at all these different things, and it's just like, if we're not careful, we'll just start to think that everybody is white or black. We'll start to bring our own kind of American categories onto the Bible, and they just look at they didn't really have the same categories of race at all, and they just looked at things way differently. And then when you even look at them, you're like, these are black and brown people in the Middle East, what we would call the Middle East, and it just changes kind of, it just challenges us.
Yep.
Well, and that goes into my last question perfectly, because a lot of people don't know those things. And so there's a skeptical college student that would start coming to college or been to college for a while. And so there's some major lies or mischaracterizations about Christianity they've been bought into culturally, whatnot, especially that it's a white man's religion. We hear that mischaracterization a lot, that you aim to correct in this book. Obviously, you're a Black author and you're defending Christianity as and in the right that we've been talking about. It's not a white man's religion. It's not, it's for all nations and all peoples. So what what's your initial, I'm just trying to think. I'm trying to like think if I was in front of you or next to you, what's your, and you have that mischaracterization or lie, that
Or like a
somebody,
student walks up to you and is
student,
like, Reverend Chavis, like my professor, whatever, my parents, my friends are saying like Christianity is for white people and it's been used to oppress black people. What
yeah.
am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to imagine what would your initial apologetic response and goal be to a false claim like that?
Yeah, man, that's really good. I mean, first off, I would try and sympathize with them.
Hmm.
I wouldn't bash
Not
them or
immediately
attack
defend.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, man, like, I feel you. Like, I feel that tension because when we look at Christian history, there are some really difficult things that we have to wrestle with. White racism has had a close relationship with Christianity in a lot of countries, and particularly in our country. And so it does bring a lot of really deep questions. We look at imperialism, we look at the scramble for Africa, we look at Jim Crow South, we look at American chattel slavery, and we see Christianity right there complicit in many ways. There's always kind of like rays of hope when we look at Christian resistance, but in many ways Christianity was complicit. And so I think a lot of students think, about really the scriptures. They're like, man, can we trust the scriptures? And the Bible, what was it tampered with? And like, yeah, some people did tamper with the Bible. They deleted parts of the Bible in order to co-opt the Bible for their own purposes. And they're skeptical about how to interpret the Bible, and just telling them, yeah, like people have misinterpreted the Bible, like the curse of Cain. People have made the curse of Cain,
Yeah.
And put it into their racist framework, and they've taken the curse of Ham and they've put that in their racist framework. And many theologians over the years have seen talk about black suffering and
Or like
oppression
Paul and
as
Philemon and his supposed complicity with racism and slavery and all that stuff.
right. And so like people have interpreted the Bible in ways where it hasn't answered the questions or asked the questions that African Americans are asking. In many ways, people have abused doctrines, like they've abused the means of grace, where people withheld baptism from Black Christians because of what it might mean.
That gets to me.
They've withheld the Lord's Supper from Black Christians because of what that might mean for their system of racism. They've abused the doctrine of providence, like where God providentially has you here. Therefore, that means that we can do what we want to you, and this is good for you. And they've abused the doctrine of the image of God, And so like, there's just so many abuses that, and even when you think about the Black church, like it was a persecuted church and was persecuted by many white Christians who wanted to maintain racist control over the Black church. And so you just got to acknowledge all that and just basically say like, all that has happened. It infuriates me too. Like it fires me up too. And you just have to like just have to distinguish along with that. And the next step is to say like, hey, but all of that is actually not Christianity of the Bible. That's not biblical religion. And so again, Dr. Carl Ellis uses this like helpful term, Christianityism, which is, Christianity, when it goes to different cultures, it takes on that culture in good and healthy ways many times. Like a church in one country should look different than a church in another country, because of it's enculturation. But
different cultural practices, different backgrounds, all that stuff.
Yeah. But syncretism can happen where Christianity is polluted by the culture and it becomes something different than Christianity. It becomes a false version of Christianity. And he calls this Christianityism. And so just helping people see the distinction between like the Christianity of the scriptures and that flows from Jesus, and the Christianity that is so polluted that it no longer becomes Christianity. And so just acknowledging like, hey, I understand how some people want to totally throw away Christianity and how they want to, they think that some other religion actually addresses the core concerns of African Americans. And this is where like Malcolm X was. He grew up in a Christian home. And he acknowledges in his autobiography that Christianity is not whitewashed, that he kind of even has a more accurate view than some people of Christianity in some places.
That's the crazy thing about some of his views on Christianity is he actually kind of gets it.
Yeah, he's like, I can't participate in this because Christianity is more than this,
Yeah.
and so he just thinks it's a joke, and so he's a Muslim. And there's other people who really gravitate more towards African traditional religions, like the Yoruba religious system, because it addresses more of the African core concerns. And so just acknowledging like, hey, I can totally see how people might be drawn to that, but actually taking a stand on the fact that the Christian faith offers hope to African Americans. It brings the most robust answers to their questions. And so talking about like penal substitutionary atonement with them and saying like some people might reject that because,
Quote unquote, cosmic
essentially
child abuse or whatever it is.
right. And also some people might say that the cross means that we give that God gives his divine approval
Oh,
to
yeah.
abuse
Yeah.
and
True.
and like surrogacy of like
Yeah.
someone
Which
using
there's
another
like some
person's body.
feminist interpretations on the cross
Yep.
too, where they talk about paternalism on the cross. Yeah, very
Yep.
similar.
And and so like saying like no, the cross actually means that like we're supposed to stand in horror at it. Like this is actually we're supposed to be horrified at it. And so, or just like the doctrine of providence, people might reject the doctrine of providence, saying like if God had anything to do with African suffering, I don't want anything to do with him. And it's like, well, without God's sovereignty, then we have no real hope. What happened to us was just by accident, because God temporarily lost control and he kind of for a moment let the universe slip outside of his power. And it's like, no, if God is not responsible for this, he weeps with us and he is against this. But we also have to acknowledge that he's control over it and he's out. And because of that, he's the God of our hope. We talk about inerrancy. Like we want to throw away parts of the Bible because they're problematic, but really why we think they're problematic is because we haven't actually interpreted them in the context of the whole counsel of God. And so like, what do these slavery passages mean within the whole counsel of God? Like, what do these different passages that seem to support racism or oppression, like what does these mean within the whole counsel of God?
Totally.
And also like we're thinking about eschatology. Like some would say that heaven makes Black people passive, that it allowed people under Jim Crow, people under American chattel slavery to just be content with their situation because they were looking forward towards a heaven.
Oh yeah, so heavenly minded, they were no earthly good.
Exactly. And so it's like, no, like the scriptures actually, the vision of the end times actually causes us to be rowdy right here, right now, because we are participating in what Jesus is doing now as we look forward to a new heavens and new earth. And so eschatology actually, when we see a future vision of the new creation, it causes us to want to usher that in the present age through Jesus. And so just really showing them how like Christianity actually gives us hope. It gives us a better answer to our questions. And when we look at the Black church in the African-American Christian tradition, we see people like all the best resistance efforts against societal evil, against personal evil and sin around African-American core concerns. When we look at the people who were most invested in loving and pouring into the African-American community, they were inspired by Christianity and by Jesus. And even some of the most unlikely people like Marcus Garvey, like a lot of people just don't know that he was a Christian. And so, so it's just really trying to convince students like, hey, this isn't something that is against us. This is something that is for us. God is for us, and the scriptures as they stand don't have to be edited. Like it delivers a word of hope, and we can't let the ways that Christianity has been abused win the day. Like when we throw away Christianity, we've let that win. We've let the ways it's been abused win. But when we actually recover it for what it is, that's when we actually are advancing.
And it seems obvious to us, but because you mentioned Malcolm X, it's amazing how many people don't know that Martin Luther King Jr. was a Christian. And
I think they do. They just don't buy it.
And there's a lot of people that aren't Christian that,
Oh yeah.
don't
I was
realize,
thinking more of like a lot of Christians will look at Martin Luther King and not buy his Christianity.
There's majority of the public seems to not think about it or understand that he was a Christian and, he stood on Christian values of responses to evil racism. I brought him up because you mentioned he was the same time era as Malcolm X.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep. Yeah. There's a lot of, and even so, in the book, I talk about C. Herbert Oliver,
Mhm.
and he was a minister in the OPC
Mhm.
and also a civil rights activist in Alabama. And so
Mhm.
you just see like, I loved it. It was fun to throw him in there because he's just so kind of close to home as far as tradition and Reformed theology.
Yep.
It's just like here you have this like Westminster grad, like and civil rights leader, and like
Nice.
African Americans have always known how to like put those two things together.
Mhm.
Like those two things were never apart from each other because of the Reformed ethical system. Really, when you think about the Shorter Catechism, Reformed theology is mostly ethics,
Yep.
right? There's the beliefs in the first third of it, and then the
Yep.
rest of the 2/3 is like
basically all ethics. Yeah.
yeah, is the 10 Commandments, how
Yeah.
we pursue
From like
grace.
43 onwards, it's all ethics.
Yep. And so it's kind of like, all right, when we think about the 10 Commandments, we don't just think about them individualistically. We think about it as a church. We think about it corporately. We're thinking about how this affects our public life, our public witness,
Yep.
our public theology. And
With
so
our neighbors, with our friends, with our families, with all that stuff.
exactly, we're thinking about politics. Like, how does this influence our politics and the policies that are passed and how people live together? And so, like, African Americans have never shied away from having theology inform every single area of life. And so there were no kind of like theological questions that were a part of their experience that were off limits. And so it's just cool to, when we look at Christian African American history, like, hey, let's actually look at how the gospel and the core tenets of the Christian faith have actually motivated these Christians to fight for African American flourishing.
Like, yeah. So last question, landing the plane, kind of two-parter. So first, just in your own ministry, how have you seen, and you talk about this a little bit in the book, and kind of how this book generated itself, but what fruit have you seen from using this approach, using this book, using this approach that you use, and others in their own context? And then related to that, a word for those who are like, yeah, I'm gonna pick up this book. We definitely encourage people to buy this book, use it in their own context, for how to use this book in the way that you would hope that it would be used in college campuses, kind of across the country and across the world.
Yeah. So I hope people use it as a discipleship resource. So actually, so when I wrote the book, I was really trying to get it done and had like this burst of energy of getting it done. And I was like, I wanted to write discussion questions, but I just didn't have the time because it just needed to get done. And so now I'm like recovering from the burst of energy it took to write the book and get it out there. And now I'm like sitting down and I'm writing up kind of really a workbook where students can walk through in like a discipleship setting all these core truths. And so I would love to see small groups use it being used in one-on-one settings, or just it being gifted to students, and not just students. I mean, I think these truths are helpful for anyone. I kind of use illustrations and speak to college students questions, but it can be helpful for anyone. And so on campus, like, it's kind of guided the topics we do in our kind of main Bible study. We've basically been doing this book for the past like several semesters. And so the first 3 semesters. We did it for 3 semesters. And we're at the end of the Shorter Catechism now. And I haven't gotten a chance to write on that yet. But I really noticed with students, because I love preaching through Bible books and I love teaching through Bible books. But I'm just like, man, it just feels so tough doing verse by verse when they don't have these basic categories yet. And so like, I just felt a burden to get these basic categories down, because even when we're preaching, when we say the word God in a passage, they're like, okay, who is God? And so I just wanted to get these basic things down, because they're just not coming with a lot of them are not coming with any type of significant Christian background. And kind of what I do is I use these topics to inform the kind of content, but then I also try and lead or maybe like advertised, so to speak, with a felt need.
Okay.
And so it's like we're going to talk about inerrancy, but we're really kind of saying, hey, in our lives, we're always looking for truth, and we're looking for an authority to speak to us. How does this relate to this specific area of the college student's life? And so we're really trying to take these, like I said earlier, take these truths and apply them to the questions that students are asking. I think the only danger with doing things so topically like this is that it can, I mean, it can feel like what it is, like, systematic theology.
Sure.
And so you just really got to be intentional with keeping it
Students
down to
keeping bored
earth
and whatnot.
like, you just got to really try intentional to keep it down to earth and like have an eye to the questions that college students are asking. But it's been fun. It like eases my conscience. I'm like, all right, I know I have a plan. I know I'm systematically working through the basics of the Christian faith. So if anyone's been in our ministry for any amount of time, they're getting the meat and potatoes,
Yeah. Has there been, just to end with maybe a short story on your side, has there been kind of a cool aha moment for one of your students after going through some of this stuff? It's like, oh yeah, this stuff caught them. Has there been like, is there a cool story that you can kind of leave our audience with as like kind of a, like, hey, like you can do this too. And this is some of the stuff that you can see from your students as a result of going through this with them.
Like encouragement.
Yeah. Some encouragement.
Yeah. So like, okay, a story of a student going through the book and they've been encouraged by the content.
Yeah. Or they like kind of a light bulb went off and it's like, that's exactly what I want you to get from this.
Yeah. So, there's one student who I'm walking with, and we kind of just meet up weekly, and she actually was one of the test readers for the book, and she was going through it, and she read the part on Bible interpretation. I believe she read that chapter, and she really kind of was like, this is what I need. Like, this is what I've been missing. Like, I need this to explain all the ins and outs of the Christian faith. And she was one of the ones who actually like wrote a blurb on the back of the book.
I was thinking this sounds familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, and she was like, this is the Bible explained function as the piece of knowledge I was missing about God. And so it's just like little stories like that where students are like, man, I'm reading the book and I really enjoyed it. Or another campus minister called me the other day, and he was telling me, man, I actually have a student, man, and she is going through depression, and I gave the book to her like a couple months ago, and she says she's picking it up, man, and this is really helping her through that. And I'm just like, man, that's encouraging, because when you write a book, you're just like, whatever, like, is out there, and okay, like, you kind of just like doubt yourself and doubt the book's gonna help people.
Did this really make any difference?
It's like, so yeah, it's like it's just like when just self-conscious, really insecurity of being an artist, and so it's just cool to see students get positive feedback. And so but I actually really haven't like really done what I want to do with the book. I really need to create some small groups around this, really create some curriculum to go through it one-on-one, because we've been doing this with our bigger Bible study, and so people have always given feedback and been like, man, I never thought about that from that angle, or I never really thought about Jesus and being God in that way. And so but it'd be fun to really get deep and be able to interact with him in a smaller setting.
Awesome. This is a call to churches to pick up this book and do a small group with it, your book study with it. Yeah.
Or to help, like RUF or IVP, like our InterVarsity Fellowship. Just send it to your like local campus ministers, or for pastors, or for lay people, if you have college students, whatever it is, or for yourself. This is kind of helpful. It was helpful for me, even like having been trained in this in seminary, but like, how do I relate this to other people, and how can I relate this to myself in a way that makes sense for them, not just that like how I want to say it, but like how does this land for somebody in a robust personal manner? And this book really helped me with that, like personally.
Yeah, I appreciate. Here's actually a cool story that is always surprising. So I was teaching. Well, it's not this book specifically, but I guess it was content that was a part of this book, but got cut out. But I was teaching on the second commandment, and I was talking about white Jesus, and how I was like, you know, basically in general, this is not helpful, and just pragmatically speaking.
Yep.
But also when we look at it from the scriptures, like we're not supposed to have images of Jesus.
Yeah, in
anyway.
multiple ways, this is bad.
Yeah. And so I was teaching on the second commandment and like looking at the effect that it has when we create images of Jesus. And so the student walks up to me afterwards and she just like, this was game changing. Like I always thought that Christianity was a white man's religion and I always put it away because of that. But you kind of like breaking down the second commandment, kind of applying it to that particular, this particular issue has really opened my eyes to like true Christianity. And so like, you know, it's just like fun things like that. You never think teaching on the second commandment and on like images
I was
would
about to
lead
say that's
to
not the usual
that
like
particular
apologetic
thing.
argument for white man's religion. Is the second commandment.
Exactly. So it's just fun stuff like that where you see like how this stuff actually, when you let it trickle down into the lives of students, it actually really makes a difference.
Oh, praise God.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Reverend Chavis, thank you so much for coming on our show. The work that you've done at Jackson State, the work that you're doing at Howard, for writing this book, for putting yourself out there, putting this out there, for helping African-American students and students across the globe of every shape, size, color, ethnicity, racial background, whatever it is, to learn more about Jesus in their particular context and how he relates to them in their particular context, how he relates to us in our particular context. So thank you so much for writing this, and thank you so much for coming on our show and talking about your book.
Man, well, I really appreciate y'all having me, and I love what you all are doing. Keep up the great work, and man, I'm just excited about the mission that y'all have. So awesome. I'm excited to be a part of it.
Appreciate it. Thank you much.